On the morning of the 21st of April 1914, the fires along a stretch of railroad track in southern Colorado had finally burned themselves out. Where a canvas town had stood the day before, there were now blackened iron bed frames, the metal bones of sewing machines, and the twisted shapes of stoves standing in cold ash. About 1,000 people had lived here through the winter, in long rows of tents rented by their union after the coal company evicted them from its houses. The tents were gone. Under one of the wooden platforms where a tent had stood, there was a pit. The families had dug these cellars themselves, by hand, to shelter their children from the rifle fire that had crossed the colony through the winter and into the spring. When searchers cleared the debris from this one and climbed down into it, they found 13 people who had gone below the floor to be safe. 2 of them were women. 11 of them were children. The youngest were small enough to be carried in one arm. They had not been shot. They had been trapped beneath the fire, while the tents above them burned, and in the dark under that floor, they had suffocated. Within days, the newspapers gave the pit a name. People called it the Death Pit, and then the Black Hole of Ludlow, and the name traveled across the country far faster than any careful account of how those children came to be in it. For the next year, almost everyone who argued about Ludlow argued about one question: who fired the first shot? It is a fair question, and the honest answer, then and now, is that no one has ever proven it. The shooting began after 2 bombs were set off as signals, and each side swore the other had started it, and the surviving record does not settle the matter. There is a sharper question, though, and here, the record is not vague at all. Once the smoke cleared, and the dead were counted, and the courtrooms finally opened, who was made to answer for them? That question has a documented answer. It is not the answer most people would guess, and it is the reason this is not really the story of one terrible afternoon. It is the story of what a powerful institution can do with the 18 months that come after. Subscribe if you want the record itself, not the version its owners paid to publish. The place to begin looks nothing like a battlefield. It begins with a company that owned almost everything a family in these canyons could see. That company was Colorado Fuel and Iron. In the first years of the 20th century, it was the largest private employer in the state. It dug coal out of the southern mountains, baked that coal into coke, fed the coke to steel furnaces, and sold the steel across the American West. But it was not only a company. In the mining camps strung along the canyons near Trinidad and Walsenburg, Colorado, Fuel and Iron was the landlord, the grocer, the doctor, the constable, the school teacher, and often the church, all at once. A miner could be born in a company house, taught in a company school, paid in a way that returned to the company store, and buried in company ground. The largest single owner of all of it lived almost 2,000 miles away, in New York. John D. Rockefeller Jr. held the controlling family interest in Colorado Fuel and Iron. He had never worked a shift in a Colorado mine, and by his own later account, he had never once visited the camps. He read reports. He trusted the men who ran the company in his name, and those men assured him the miners were satisfied, and for a long time he believed them. Hold on to that distance, because it becomes important later. The man with the most power over these camps knew them only on paper. What the paper never captured was the shape of an ordinary day underground. A coal miner in these camps was not paid for the hours he worked. He was paid for the weight of the coal he sent up out of the mine. That single arrangement governed everything else. It meant the company set a family's income every time it weighed a car of coal. And it meant that the honesty of the scale was, quite literally, the honesty of the paycheck. Here, a strange old word enters the story, a word most people have never had a reason to learn: checkweighman. A checkweighman was a weigher chosen by the miners themselves to stand at the scale and confirm that a full car of coal was recorded as a full car. Colorado law said the miners were allowed to elect one. In many camps they could not, because the company owned the scale and ran it. A car a man had filled to the brim could be marked short, and there was no one standing at his shoulder with the authority to object. When the miners later wrote down what they were fighting for, an honest weigher sat near the top of the list. It sounds like a small clerical matter. It was the daily difference between being paid for your labor and being quietly cheated of part of it. Then there was the money itself, and where it was allowed to go. Colorado had outlawed payment in company scrip in 1899. Scrip was a private paper currency, good only at the company store. The law against it was plain. The law was also widely ignored. In camp after camp, a family's wages had a way of flowing back to the company almost as quickly as they were paid, through a store whose prices ran higher than the shops in the free towns down the valley, through rent on a company house, and through fees the company alone decided. A man could work a full month in the dark and discover, on payday, that the company's books said he owed more than he had earned. To feel how the money actually worked, follow a single payday. A miner spent the month loading coal, and against his earnings the company had already set a row of deductions. There was rent on the company house. There was the fee for the company doctor, taken whether or not anyone in the family had been ill. There was the powder and the tools and the oil for his lamp, often bought from the company at the company's price. And there was whatever the family had bought on credit at the company store across the month, at the company's own steadily marked up prices. When all of it was subtracted, the cash that remained could be very small, and in a hard month, it could disappear entirely, so that a man who had gone down every day came to the pay window and was told he had earned nothing, or that he owed. The scale that shorted his tonnage and the store that inflated his costs were working the same seam from opposite ends. Between them, a family could labor to the edge of exhaustion and never quite get ahead, because the arrangement was not built to let them get ahead. It was built to keep them working and dependent and exactly where the company needed them to be. And the work killed people at a rate that is genuinely hard to hold in the mind. Between 1884 and 1912, more than 1,700 men died in Colorado's coal mines. That was roughly twice the national rate for the same work. These were not distant statistics to the families in the camps. In 1910 alone, 3 explosions ripped through the southern field. At Primero, 75 men were killed. At Starkville, 56. At Delagua, 79. Fathers and sons went down the same shaft, and in a single morning, a camp could lose a quarter of its men. The company ran the mines. The state had written safety laws. The laws sat on the books while the men kept dying, because the laws were not enforced. There was a further cruelty folded into how the work itself was paid, and it is worth drawing out because it shaped who lived and who died underground. A miner rose before light and went down into a shaft where the 2 great dangers were gas and the roof, either of which could kill a dozen men before anyone reached the surface. And much of the labor that kept him alive down there was labor he was never paid for. Setting timber, clearing fallen rock, making a worked-out section safe. All of it was time and risk that produced no coal for the scale. And so, under a system that paid only for tonnage, it paid nothing at all. A man could spend an hour keeping himself and the men beside him from being buried, and be the poorer for the caution. That was the trap set beneath the trap. The work most likely to save a life was the work the wage was built to punish, and a miner in a hurry to feed his family had every incentive to skip it. None of this had fallen out of the sky in the autumn of 1913. The southern field had been fought over before. About a decade earlier, in the first years of the century, the miners had tried to organize and strike, and the operators had beaten them, and the memory of that defeat sat in the camps like an old wound that never fully closed. The men who walked out in 1913 were not naive about what they were taking on. They had lost this same fight once already. What had changed was not the odds against them. What had changed was that the conditions had become, for enough of them, no longer bearable in silence. There is one more piece of this world that has to be named, because it shaped everything and because it was deliberate. The operators had built their workforce out of many different peoples on purpose. Greeks, Italians, Mexicans, Slavs, Welsh, and more had been recruited in part on a simple theory. Men who could not easily talk to one another, could not easily combine against the company. A camp that spoke more than 24 languages was a camp that was very hard to weld into a single fist. That strategy had worked for years, and it was the Union's central obstacle. The slow, unglamorous work that made 1913 different from every earlier failure was the work of building enough trust across all those languages that the camps could finally act as one body instead of 20 frightened fragments. So this was the world before the strike, a company that behaved like a government. A wage decided by a scale the worker was not allowed to watch. Earnings that drained back through a store the worker could not avoid, and a death rate the worker could not outrun. None of it was hidden. Much of it was, on paper, already illegal. That is the first thing the record shows, and it is the thing most retellings skip past. The miners were not demanding something strange or new. For years they had been asking, first and above all, that the laws already written be obeyed. Consider the 8-hour day. Colorado's own voters had approved an 8-hour limit for miners years before the strike, and they had approved it by a wide margin. Turning that vote into a law the courts would enforce took years more, tangled in the state legislature, and even after it existed, the Southern mines did not reliably keep it. Men still went down for 10 hours, for 12, for as long as the coal demanded. So when the miners finally organized, one of their central demands was not for some new privilege. It was that the state honor a promise its own voters had already made. The organizing came through the United Mine Workers of America. The Union had tried the southern Colorado field before and been beaten back. What the operators feared most was not any single demand. It was recognition itself. The idea that they would have to sit across a table from a union and bargain rather than set every term alone. Recognition was the one thing they were determined never to grant, and it shaped everything that followed. On the 15th of September 1913, delegates met in Trinidad and set down what they wanted. There were 7 demands, and it is worth hearing them plainly, because the myth of Ludlow depends on people never learning how ordinary they were. First, recognition of the Union. Second, a raise of 10% on the tonnage rates, the pay for coal dug. Third, pay for what the miners called dead work, the timbering and clearing and track laying that kept a man alive underground, but that the company had never paid him to do. Fourth, the right to elect their own checkweighman, an honest weigher at the scale. Fifth, to be paid twice a month. Sixth, the right to trade at any store, to live in any house, and to see any doctor they chose, rather than the company's. And seventh, enforcement of the mining laws Colorado already had, along with an end to the company guard system. Read that list again and notice something. At least 3 of those 7 demands were simply requests that existing law be obeyed. The 8-hour day was already the will of the voters. The checkweighman was already the miners' legal right. The ban on scrip was already on the books. The men were not reaching for revolution. For much of the list, they were reaching for the law. Of the 7 demands, one towered over the rest in the operators' minds, and it was recognition. A 10% raise costs money, but money can be recovered. An honest scale costs a little coal. Even the enforcement of the 8-hour day, painful as it was, left the company in charge of its own mines. Recognition was different in kind. To recognize the union was to admit that the miners had a permanent, organized voice that the company would have to answer to, not once, but forever, at every future dispute. It meant the end of the company's absolute authority over its own kingdom. That is why, of everything on the list, recognition was the line the operators would not cross, and why they were willing to spend so much, and ultimately, to risk so much, to avoid crossing it. The strike, at its core, was not about any single grievance. It was about whether the men who dug the coal would ever be allowed to speak with one voice. The company refused all of it, and refused above all to recognize the union. And so on the 23rd of September, 1913, roughly 9,000 miners walked off the job across the southern field. They knew what walking off would cost them because they lived in the company's houses. To strike was to be evicted. The union had planned for this. It had leased open ground near the mouths of the canyons and bought thousands of tents. And now the eviction came. Families loaded everything they owned onto wagons in a cold rain that turned the roads to mud and moved out of the company towns and onto the leased land. Children rode on top of the furniture. The colonies rose where the canyon roads met the plain, positioned so that the strikers could see who came and went from the mines. The largest of these tent towns stood about half a mile north of a railroad stop called Ludlow. Roughly 1,000 people lived there, in something close to 200 tents laid out in streets. They came from everywhere. By this period, the coal workers of southern Colorado spoke more than 24 languages among them. Greeks, Italians, Mexicans, Slavs, Welsh, and many more shared the same rows. That mixture was not an accident. The operators had long recruited a workforce split across many tongues, on the theory that men who could not easily talk to one another could not easily unite. The union's whole task was to prove that theory wrong, to build one strike out of 27 languages. One of the people who made that possible at Ludlow was a Greek immigrant named Louis Tikas. He had come to America years earlier, had run a coffee house in Denver, and had become an organizer for the union. He was steady, he was trusted, and he could move between the Greek miners and the rest of the colony and the union leadership. He had been born on the island of Crete and had come to America like so many others in search of a wage that did not exist at home. Before the coal field, he had run a coffee house in Denver's Greek community, a gathering place where new arrivals found news and work and one another. That is a useful thing to know about him, because it explains what he became at Ludlow. He was not a soldier or a firebrand. He was a man other men listened to, someone who had spent years helping frightened immigrants find their footing in a country that did not want them, and who now brought that same steadiness to a tent colony full of families far from home. The Greek miners trusted him because he was one of them, and the Union trusted him because he could hold a fractious, many-tongued community together and speak for it. In the months to come, he would try, more than once, to stand between armed men and the families in the tents. Remember his name. The record has a great deal to say about how he died, and almost nothing that reflects well on the men who killed him. As autumn turned, the colony dug in for a Colorado winter on the high plain, where the wind comes down off the mountains with nothing to stop it. The families banked earth against the tent walls for warmth, and beneath some of the tents they dug cellars, pits in the ground floored with boards, where a mother could put her children when the shooting started. Because by then, the shooting had already started. The strike was not a quiet standoff. From almost the beginning, it was punctuated by gunfire, and the families had learned to send the children underground. That is the detail to carry forward. The cellar under the burning tent, the one that would be found full of the dead in April, was not a freak of that single day. It was a piece of ordinary architecture, in a place where children had spent an entire winter learning to hide from bullets. The families had built the very shelters that would trap them, because the alternative, above ground, had already proven deadly. It is worth sitting for a moment with what the tent colonies actually were, because the surviving story so often reduces them to a mob or to helpless victims, and they were neither. They were organized communities, built on purpose and run with real discipline. The Union laid the tents out in streets. There were committees to handle supplies and sanitation and disputes. There were schools for the children and gatherings in the evenings, and the many nationalities that the operators had recruited to keep the men divided now lived side by side in the same rows, sharing food and language lessons and the daily labor of keeping a canvas town alive through a Colorado winter. The colony at Ludlow was, in its way, a rebuttal to the company's whole theory of control. It was proof that Greeks and Italians and Mexicans and Slavs could in fact govern themselves together, and that proof frightened the operators more than any single demand on the list. Remember too what it had cost these families simply to arrive at the tents. To strike was to be evicted, because the houses belonged to the company. When the walkout came, the evictions came with it, and they came as autumn was turning. Families carried everything they owned out of the company towns and down the roads to the leased ground, some of them in a cold rain that turned everything to mud. Children perched on top of stacked furniture on the wagons. They were leaving the only shelter many of them had, going into tents in the mountains as winter approached, with no promise of victory at the end of it. People do not do that lightly. They do it when staying has become worse than leaving. To understand why the shooting had started and why it kept getting worse, you have to meet the men the operators sent to keep order, because the company did not simply own the mines and the stores. It had built, over years, a private apparatus of force, and then it had persuaded the state to lend that apparatus a uniform. Long before the strike, the operators had learned that owning the mines was not enough. They wanted to control who came near them, and for that, they built a private force. When the trouble grew, they reached outside Colorado and brought in the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a firm out of the eastern coalfields whose specialty was breaking strikes. These were not local constables who knew the families. They were professionals, hired to watch, to intimidate, and if it came to it, to fight. The pressure on the colony was constant and physical. At night, searchlights mounted near the camps swept back and forth across the tents, so that a family trying to sleep would have a beam pass over the canvas again and again, a reminder that they were being watched and that they could be seen. Guards fired rifles toward the colony at intervals through the fall and winter. It was not yet the massacre. It was a slow, grinding campaign of fear designed to make life in the tents unbearable enough that the men would give up and go back down the mines. Then there was the machine the miners came to call the Death Special. The operators had taken an ordinary automobile to the Colorado Fuel and Iron Steel Works in Pueblo and armored it with steel plate fabricated in the company's own mill. On top, they mounted machine guns. This armored car would drive along the edges of the tent colonies and, on more than one occasion, rake them with fire. Try to picture what that meant for the people inside the canvas. There is no wall in a tent. A family's only defense against a machine gun was a hole in the ground. That is why the cellars existed. The Death Special is the reason a mother in Ludlow already knew, months before April, exactly where she would put her children when the shooting started. It would be dishonest to tell this as a story of one side only. The strikers were not unarmed, and they were not always passive. Many of the miners owned rifles, and the Union brought in more. There were exchanges of fire through the winter, in which guards and strikebreakers were shot, and men on the company's side were killed, as well as men on the Union's. When strikebreakers were brought in to reopen the mines, armed strikers sometimes moved to stop them, and blood was spilled in both directions. A tent colony on a war footing is a frightening thing to the men outside it, too. The record shows a field where both sides were armed and both sides killed. What it does not show is symmetry, because only one side had an armored car, only one side had the machine guns of a steel company, and only one side would soon have the uniform and the legal authority of the state. The fall of 1913 was not quiet, and the killing did not begin at Ludlow. Through October and into the coalfield saw a running series of clashes. Guards fired into the colonies. Strikers fired on guards, and on the strikebreakers being brought in to reopen the mines. Men died on both sides, in ones and twos, in gun battles at the mine mouths and along the canyon roads, in a slow accumulation that rarely reached the national papers, but that hardened everyone who lived through it. By the time the militia arrived, southern Colorado had already been at a low, grinding war for weeks. The imported detectives were at the center of much of it. These were men with no stake in the place beyond the wage, and the agency understood that a strike is broken not only by force but by exhaustion. So the pressure was designed to wear people down. The searchlight sweeping the tents at night was one instrument of it. The sudden burst of rifle fire into a colony was another. So was the plain, daily fact of armed strangers patrolling the edge of a place where families were trying to keep children fed and warm. Nothing about it was subtle, and nothing about it was accidental. It was a siege conducted at low volume, month after month, and there had already been a lethal warning of what the tents could become. Earlier in the strike, another colony had been raked with gunfire, and people had been killed, and the armored car with its mounted machine guns had already shown what it could do to rows of canvas. So when the families at Ludlow dug their cellars into the ground, They were not imagining a danger out of nervousness. They were answering one that had already taken lives. In a real sense, everything that happened on the 20th of April had been rehearsed, in smaller and quieter forms, all through the winter. The elements were all present and tested. The only thing that had not yet arrived was the scale. That authority is where the winter turned. As the fighting spread, and the sheriffs of the coal counties proved unable or unwilling to keep any kind of peace, the governor of Colorado, Elias Ammons, called out the state's National Guard in late October of 1913. And here something happened that many of the miners did not expect. At first, they welcomed the soldiers. They believed, reasonably, that a neutral force answering to the state rather than the company might finally protect them. Some of the colonies met the arriving troops with an American flag and something close to relief. That hope did not survive the winter, and the reason it did not is one of the most important facts in the whole story. Keep it in mind as the shooting gets closer, because it changes who, exactly, was standing on the hills above Ludlow in April. The men in uniform did not stay who they had been in October. The guard that came in October answered, on paper, to the governor. In practice, it answered to a commander named John Chase, a Denver eye doctor who had led militia in an earlier Colorado mining war a decade before at Cripple Creek, where the soldiers had ended up firmly on the side of the mine owners. Chase ran the coal field like occupied territory. He set up military detentions without charges. He treated the strikers less as citizens with a grievance than as an enemy to be subdued. The clearest early sign of what the Guard had become involved, an old woman, Mary Harris Jones, known across the country simply as Mother Jones, was a labor organizer then in her 70s, small and white-haired and utterly fearless, and the operators regarded her as more dangerous than any rifle in the colony. When she came to southern Colorado to rally the miners, the militia arrested her and held her for weeks, moved from place to place, kept away from lawyers and reporters, detained without any charge a court would recognize. The point was not to try her. The point was to keep her voice away from the men in the tents. Her detention brought matters to a head in the streets of Trinidad on the 22nd of January, 1914. A crowd of women, many of them miners' wives, marched to protest that an old woman was being held without charge. They were met by mounted militia. What followed was recorded by more than one witness. General Chase, riding among the marchers, fell from his horse. Humiliated, he ordered his cavalry to clear the street, and the soldiers rode into a crowd of women, swinging. Some of the marchers were cut with sabers. It is a small scene against everything that came later, but it tells you plainly where the Guard now stood. State troops had ridden down unarmed women on behalf of a coal company's peace. And then came the fact that turned the Guard, over the winter, into something it had never been meant to be. The state of Colorado could not afford it. Keeping hundreds of soldiers in the field, month after month, drained a treasury that did not have the money, and the legislature would not or could not refill it. Into that gap stepped the operators. Through the winter, the companies effectively helped keep the Guard in the field, advancing funds and supplies to a force that was supposed to be neutral between them and the strikers. You cannot pay for an army and remain a stranger to it. By the spring of 1914, the consequences of that arrangement were visible on the ground. As the state's money finally gave out, most of the Guard was withdrawn, but the units left in place near the colonies were no longer filled with ordinary state soldiers. Their ranks had been thinned and then refilled, increasingly, with mine guards and company employees who had been sworn in and handed the uniform of the Colorado National Guard. So by April, the men on the hills above Ludlow were, to a significant degree, the company's own private force wearing the state's colors. The uniform said, Colorado. The paychecks and the loyalties, in too many cases, said Colorado Fuel and Iron. One of the officers commanding in that sector was a lieutenant named Carl Linderfelt. He had contempt for the strikers, most of them immigrants whose languages he did not speak and whose cause he despised, and he made little effort to hide it. He was a soldier who had wanted a war and now had something close to one. Remember him alongside Louis Ticas, because the two men would meet on the 20th of April, and the meeting would last only a moment, and it would end with a rifle broken and a man dead. Chase's rule over the coal field had the texture of an occupation more than of policing. He held men in military custody without charges and without the ordinary protections a court would demand. He treated the tent colonies as hostile camps to be watched and broken, rather than as the homes of citizens with a legal grievance. Under his command, the militia searched, detained, and moved people around the field, largely as it pleased, and the ordinary machinery by which a person answers an accusation and is judged simply did not apply. When soldiers behave as though the law is suspended, they learn habits that are very hard to put down again. And the men who would stand on Water Tank Hill in April had spent the winter learning exactly those habits. The money is what sealed it, and the money is worth being precise about, because it is the hinge the whole tragedy turns on. A state militia is expensive. Feeding, housing, arming, and paying hundreds of soldiers month after month is a cost, and Colorado did not have it. The legislature would not raise it. And so, quietly, the burden shifted. Through the winter, the operators helped keep the guard in the field, advancing the funds and the supplies that the state could not. A force that was created to stand between the two sides was now being kept alive by one of them. No one had to issue an order for the militia to change allegiance. The change followed the money, the way it usually does. By the spring, the effect was written into the very roster of the men in uniform. As the state's resources finally failed, most of the guard was pulled out. But the companies still wanted armed men in the field, and so the units that remained were refilled, more and more, with mine guards and company employees who were sworn in and issued the uniform of the Colorado National Guard. The distinction between the company's private force and the state's soldiers, never solid, now nearly dissolved. The men left facing the Ludlow colony in April were in large part the same kind of men who had crewed the searchlights and the armored car all winter. Only now they carried the authority of the state along with their rifles. That is the single most important thing to understand about who did the shooting. They were not neutral soldiers who lost control. They were, to a great degree, the company's own men, wearing the state's colors, doing the company's work with the law's permission. So here is where the winter leaves us, on the eve of the day everyone remembers. A tent colony of about 1,000 people, dug in against the cold and against the bullets. Its children rehearsed in going underground. A company that had built an armored car and imported professional strikebreakers. And a militia that had begun as the miners hoped for protector and had curdled, through money and time, into an extension of the company it was meant to police. Every element of the disaster was already in place. What remained was a spark, and on the morning of the 20th of April, 1914, more than one appeared at once. The day before had been a celebration. Many of the families in the Ludlow colony were Greek, and the 19th of April, 1914, was their Orthodox Easter. There had been food and music and a rare afternoon that felt almost like peace. Some of the men had played baseball on the open ground. Guardsmen had watched from a distance, and there had been words, small threats traded across the field, the kind that had become ordinary. Then the sun went down on Easter, and the next morning came, and the next morning was the 20th. It began, as these things often do, with something small and disputed. A woman came to the militia and said a man was being held in the colony against his will. Whether that was true has never been clear. What matters is what the militia did with it. Major Patrick Hamrock, commanding the guard detachment at Ludlow, sent word that he wanted Louis Ticus to come and discuss the matter. Ticus went. He met the officers near the railroad depot, and the two sides talked, and the talk went nowhere, and Ticus started back toward the colony. While that conversation was happening, the soldiers were doing something else. They were moving a machine gun up onto a rise the miners called Water Tank Hill, a position that looked straight down into the rows of tents. From inside the colony, the strikers could see the militia massing and taking the high ground above their families. They did what frightened armed men do. They grabbed their rifles. A group of them, mostly Greeks, moved out toward a railroad cut, trying to get into a position to protect the colony's flank if the soldiers came down the hill. Now, there were armed men on both sides, in the open, a few hundred yards apart, each convinced the other was about to attack. And into that gap ran Louis Ticus, waving a white handkerchief over his head, trying to wave his own men back, trying to keep the two lines from touching off. It is worth pausing on that image, because the record is clear about it, and because it complicates any story of two mobs simply blundering into slaughter. The Union leader at Ludlow spent the first minutes of the 20th of April trying to stop the fight. Everything about those first minutes was a study in how fast a fragile peace can come apart. The two sides had spent the winter learning to read each other's movements as threats, and now every movement was won. When the miners saw soldiers hauling a machine gun onto the hill above their families, they did not see a precaution. They saw the opening of an attack, and they moved to meet it. When the soldiers saw armed Greeks filing toward the railroad cut, they did not see men trying to protect a colony. They saw a flanking maneuver, and they braced for it. Each side's defensive move looked, to the other, exactly like preparation for slaughter. And in the narrow space between those two misreadings stood one man with a white handkerchief, trying to buy a few more minutes of calm that no one else in the field seemed to want. He failed. The militia set off 2 dynamite bombs, meant as a signal to bring in other troops. To the strikers, 2 explosions sounded like the opening of an attack. Somewhere in that instant, someone fired. It has never been established which side fired first, and it is worth being honest that it probably never will be. Each side swore for the rest of their lives that the other had started it. The record can tell us almost everything about that day, except the one detail people most want: the identity of the first finger on the first trigger. Hold both of those truths at once. The first shot is unknown. Almost everything that came after it is not. What came after was 14 hours of gunfire. The machine gun on Water Tank Hill opened on the colony and swept the rows. Rifle fire crossed the camp in both directions. The strikers in the cut and in the arroyo to the north fired back, and some of them were good shots, and the fight was real and two-sided in a way the word massacre can obscure. This was not, in its first hours, soldiers shooting people who could not shoot back. It was a battle. Men on the company's side were hit. Men on the Union's side were hit. That is part of the record too, and leaving it out does the truth no favors. But there is a difference between the men firing from the cut and the people they were firing to protect, and that difference is the heart of what happened at Ludlow. Behind the fighters, in the rows of tents, were the families. About 1,000 people had been living in that colony, and most of them were not holding rifles. They were women and children and old men, and when the machine gun opened up, there was nowhere for them to go but down into the cellars they had dug for exactly this, the pits beneath the tent floors. All through that long day, while the men traded fire on the edges, mothers sat in holes in the ground, with their children pressed against them, listening to the bullets pass through the canvas above their heads, waiting for it to stop. As the hours wore on, the imbalance in the fight became plainer. The strikers in the cut and the arroyo were determined and, some of them, well practiced with a rifle, but they were fighting a force that held the high ground and the machine gun and a steadier supply of ammunition. A rifle in the hands of a miner runs dry. A machine gun on a hill, fed by soldiers, does not tire the same way. So even in its two-sided hours, the battle was not a contest between equals. It was a defense, mounted by a smaller and more lightly armed group, of ground they could not afford to lose because their families were behind them. The men in the cut were not trying to win a battle. They were trying to keep a line long enough for the people in the tents to live through the day. It did not stop. It went on through the morning and into the afternoon, the machine gun and the rifles, the tents shredding, the families underground. For a while in the afternoon, a passing train stopped on the tracks between the militia and the colony, and in the shelter of it, some of the people were able to run for the arroyo and the open country beyond, carrying children, leaving everything they owned. Others could not reach it, or would not leave, or believed the cellars were safer than the open ground. As the light began to go, the shooting still had not ended, and the worst of the day was not the battle. The worst of the day came with the dark. As night fell, the militia came down off the hill and into the colony, and the tents began to burn. Witnesses described soldiers moving through the rows with torches and going into tents to take what they wanted before setting them alight. Whether every fire was set by a deliberate hand or some spread from overturned lamps in the chaos was later argued, as everything about that day was argued. But the pattern the survivors described was consistent. The soldiers entered the colony, and the colony burned, and they did little to help the people still inside it. Luis Ticas had not run. Through the day and into the dark, he had stayed near the colony, trying to get families out, and near the end he was taken prisoner by the militia along with 2 other captured men. What followed was witnessed, and part of it was later admitted by the man who did it. Lieutenant Karl Linderfelt came face to face with Ticas. He took his Springfield rifle in both hands and swung it, and brought it down across Ticas's head hard enough to break the wooden stock of the gun. Linderfelt admitted, afterward, that he had struck Ticas with his rifle. Ticas was left wounded and in the hands of the soldiers. A short time later, he and the 2 other captured men were shot. When Luis Ticas's body was recovered, there were 3 bullets in his back. Set that sequence down plainly, because it is the cleanest single window into the character of the day. A captured man, already beaten, already in custody, already helpless, shot in the back. Whatever one wants to call the wider fight, The killing of Louis Ticus was not a battle, it was an execution. And then there was the cellar. Beneath one of the burning tents, in a pit dug for exactly the danger that had come, a group of women and children had taken shelter when the shooting began that morning, and had stayed there through the long day, because underground had always been the safe place. Now the tent above them was on fire. The smoke and the heat came down into the pit, and there was no way out that did not lead up into the flames. 13 of them died there, 2 women and 11 children, not from bullets but from the fire and the smoke, in the dark, together. 2 women who had gone into that cellar lived. One of them was named Mary Petrucci. She climbed out of the pit into the morning, having lost her 3 children in it. She would later travel and speak about what had happened. And something she said has lasted, because it refuses the easy shape of a hero's story. She said that she used to be happy and to sing, and that she did not sing anymore. There is no way to improve on that sentence, and no need to try. It is what the day cost, stated by someone who paid it. The morning of the 21st of April was the morning this story opened with. The fires had burned down. The searchers came through the ruins of the colony, and they lifted the debris away from the pit, and they found the 2 women and the 11 children who had not gotten out. That is the image that named the event, the Black Hole of Ludlow. It went out over the telegraph wires and into the newspapers, and for a few days the country looked, genuinely looked, at what had happened on a patch of leased ground in southern Colorado. What the survivors described afterward fills in the hours the bare timeline leaves blank. They spoke of a day spent underground, while the canvas world above them was torn apart, of mothers keeping children quiet in the dark, of the long uncertainty of not knowing whether the next hour would bring rescue or fire. They described soldiers moving through the colony as the light failed, going into tents to take what they wanted before the flames took the rest. And some described being driven back when they tried to reach the wounded or carry water. Help that should have come quickly came slowly, and into that gap, the fire had all the time it needed. It is worth resisting the urge to turn these people into symbols, because the record leaves them as people. They had ordinary names and ordinary plans. The children who died in the pit had been playing on that open ground 2 days before, at the Easter gathering, in the last good afternoon the colony would ever have. The families had banked their tents against the cold, and dug their cellars against the guns, and done everything within a family's power to survive a hard winter on rented ground. And it had not been enough, because the thing that finally came for them was not a thing a family can prepare against. There is a bitter turn hidden inside the word shelter here, and it deserves to be said plainly. The cellars had kept the children safe from bullets all winter. On the 20th of April, the very feature that had protected them became the thing that killed them, because the danger changed direction. All winter it had come sideways, as gunfire, and underground was the answer to that. Now it came down, as smoke and heat from the burning tent above, and underground became a trap. The families had made a sound choice 100 times. On the 101st time, the rules changed without warning, and the sound choice turned fatal. There is no version of that day in which the people in the pit did anything wrong. How many died at Ludlow on the 20th of April is a number worth stating carefully, because even here the sources vary, and an honest account says so. The most common figure for the dead at the colony that day is about 21 people. Among them were Louis Ticus and 2 other Union men, 1 member of the National Guard, an 11-year-old boy, and several more, including the children in the pit. Some careful accounts put the toll a little lower, at 19, and some a little higher, closer to 25, depending on who is counted and over exactly what hours. The range itself is part of the truth. What is not in dispute is the cellar and the children in it, and the fact that they had gone underground to be safe from the guns of men who were, by then, wearing the uniform of the state. For a few days, the country genuinely looked. The photographs that came out of the ruined colony did something that columns of strike statistics never had. They showed the blackened bed frames standing in the ash where tents had been, the ordinary wreckage of ordinary homes, and then the reports of what had been found in the cellar. A strike in a distant state was an abstraction most Americans could ignore. Dead children in a pit were not. The funerals drew crowds. The dead were carried through the streets of the coal towns while thousands watched. And for a brief window, the events at a railroad stop most of the nation had never heard of became front-page news from coast to coast. It felt, in those first days, as though the sheer visibility of it would force a reckoning, as though a thing seen this clearly could not simply be absorbed and set aside. That window is important to mark, because it did not stay open, and the story of how it was closed is the real subject of the second half of this film. In late April of 1914, the public was looking straight at what corporate power, backed by state guns, had done to a colony of families. The question that would decide everything was not whether people would be outraged. They were. The question was whether the outrage would be allowed to harden into memory and consequence, or whether it could be managed, redirected, and finally allowed to fade. Powerful people were about to make sure it faded, and they would largely succeed, but not yet. Not in these first days, when the country was still looking. The news traveled fast, and the reaction was immediate and furious. But it did not travel alone, and it did not travel only in one direction. Even as the outrage spread, another story was already beginning to form, a quieter and more organized story about agitators and about who was really to blame. That second story is where this account is truly headed. But before we follow it into the offices of the powerful, we have to follow the miners, because the people in the colonies did not respond to Ludlow with grief alone. For 10 days, southern Colorado came as close to open war as any place in America had come in a very long time. When the news of Ludlow reached the other colonies and the Union halls, grief turned very quickly into rage, and the rage picked up a rifle. What followed over the next 10 days is sometimes left out of the gentler tellings, and it should not be, because it is both part of the record and a test of whether we are describing real people or cardboard saints. The miners of southern Colorado went to war. Union leaders issued what amounted to a call to arms. Men who had spent the winter being fired on now went on the attack. Across the southern field, strikers assaulted mines, burned company buildings, tore up the works, and fought running battles with guards and strikebreakers and militia. Mines that had reopened were shut by force. Company property went up in flames along the canyons. Guards and mine employees were killed. This was not a protest. For roughly 10 days, from the 21st of April into the first days of May, a stretch of Colorado passed out of the control of any government at all, and the people doing much of the killing in that period were the miners. It matters to say that clearly. The families in the tents were, overwhelmingly, victims of a system and of the men who guarded it, and the strikers, in their fury after Ludlow, also killed and burned and destroyed. One account of those 10 days counts 28 dead and 41 wounded, And even that is uncertain, because in a spasm of open fighting, nobody keeps a careful ledger. Holding both of those facts together is not a way of excusing what was done to the colony. It is the only way to keep this account honest. The miners were not only acted upon. For 10 days they acted, and some of what they did was terrible, and it grew directly out of what had been done to them. The scale of those 10 days is hard to overstate. This was not a scattered outburst. Across the southern field, armed miners moved on mine after mine, and the fighting spread along the canyons for miles. Company works were burned. Mine buildings were destroyed. In some places, the strikers drove the guards and their forces out entirely and held the ground. The smoke over the coal field in the last days of April was no longer coming only from Ludlow. It was rising from a dozen sites where men who had buried their neighbors were now taking their revenge in the most direct terms available to them. For a short and genuinely dangerous period, an armed rising held a stretch of an American state. And it must be said that innocent distinctions blur in a rising like that. The strikers were striking at the company and its guards. But the violence of those days was not surgical, and men who had little to do with Ludlow died in it too. This is the hard center of the honest account. The same grief that makes the death of the children in the pit unbearable does not purchase a blank check for everything done in their name afterward. Both things are in the record. The families were wronged terribly, and then, in their fury, some of the strikers did wrong in return, and a clear-eyed telling holds the two together, rather than hiding whichever one is less convenient. The state could not stop it. Colorado's guard was broken and discredited, and, in places, effectively defeated. Governor Ammons, who had helped set this in motion by sending in a militia the state could not afford and would not control, now had no way to end it. So he did what governors do when the machinery has failed. He asked Washington for help. President Woodrow Wilson sent the United States Army. Around the 1st of May 1914, roughly 1,600 federal soldiers arrived in Trinidad and moved out into the coal field. And here the record offers a small, clarifying contrast. The federal troops did something the state militia had stopped doing months earlier. They acted as a neutral force. They disarmed everyone, the strikers and the mine guards, and the remnants of the National Guard alike. They took the guns out of the coal field, and the fighting stopped. Think about what that neutrality reveals in hindsight. The violence of the 10 days was terrible, but it ended almost as soon as a genuinely impartial authority arrived and took the weapons from both sides. The problem in southern Colorado had never been that order was impossible. The problem was that the force sent to keep order had been captured by one of the two parties it was supposed to stand between. When a force arrived that belonged to neither side, the war ended in days. When the guns were finally collected, the coal field that emerged was a ruin of a different kind. The Ludlow colony was ash. The dead had been buried, some of them in ceremonies that drew large and grieving crowds, and the survivors were scattered, taken into other colonies or into towns, or simply gone. The families who had spent a winter building a community out of 27 languages watched federal soldiers stack the rifles of both sides, and understood, correctly, that the arrival of order was not the arrival of justice. Order meant the shooting stopped. It did not mean anyone would answer for the pit, and it did not mean the miners had won a single thing they had walked out for. It meant only that the killing was over and the waiting had begun. The federal troops kept an uneasy peace through the rest of the year. But keeping the peace is not the same as settling anything, and nothing had been settled. The mines reopened. The strike dragged on for months more, the families still intense through another turn of the seasons, the union spending money it did not have to feed people it could not employ. And in December of 1914, worn down and out of resources, the United Mine Workers of America called the strike off. They had not won recognition. They had not won the check weighman or the enforcement of the 8-hour day or any of the 7 demands as a matter of contract. By the only measure the Union itself would have used at the outset, the Great Southern Colorado Strike was a defeat. Step back and take in the whole shape of it, because the numbers alone tell a story the single day cannot. This was not one afternoon. It was a war of roughly 14 months, from the walkout in the autumn of 1913 to the Union's surrender the following December. It stretched across a chain of tent colonies, holding thousands of people through 2 turns of the seasons. And the dead were not counted only at Ludlow. Across the whole span of the Colorado Coalfield War, the deaths ran well into the dozens, by some counts far higher, in the daily shootings, and the set battles, and the 10 days of open rising. Ludlow is the name we remember because of the pit and the children, and rightly so. But the pit sat inside a much larger and longer catastrophe, and the families endured not a single terrible day, but more than a year of siege, grief, and hunger, at the end of which they had lost. So if the story were only about the strike, it would end here, in failure, with the families drifting away from the burned colony and the company still in command of the canyons. But the story is not only about the strike, because the guns going silent did not end the fight over Ludlow. It only moved the fight to new ground. The next battle would be fought in courtrooms and in a congressional hearing room in New York, and finally in the mailboxes of newspaper editors across the country. And that second battle, the quiet one, is the one that decided what the word Ludlow would come to mean. It is time to leave the coal field and follow the record into the rooms where the powerful decided how they would answer for the dead. Every violent event of any size produces investigations, and Ludlow produced several. But the first and most revealing one was the inquiry the Colorado National Guard conducted into itself. The men who had held the hills above the colony were soldiers of the state, and so the state, through the military, would judge whether they had done wrong. Read that sentence again and notice the shape of it. The institution that had burned the colony would decide whether the colony had been wronged. The scale of the proceeding was not small, and this is important because it means the Guard could not later claim the matter had been overlooked. More than 20 members of the National Guard, including 10 officers, were brought before a general court-martial. They faced 63 separate charges arising from the strike and from Ludlow. On paper, this looks like accountability. A serious military court, dozens of charges, officers in the dock. If you stopped reading the record here, you might come away believing the system had worked. Then you reach the verdict. In August of 1914, the court-martial finished its work, and the governor approved its findings. And the findings were these: every one of the accused was acquitted, all of them, on 63 charges arising from a day that left about 21 people dead, including 2 women and 11 children in a pit. The number of guardsmen found criminally responsible was 0. The single exception proves the rule so perfectly that it reads almost like a dark joke. Lieutenant Carl Linderfelt, The officer who had broken his rifle over the head of Louis Ticus shortly before Ticus was shot 3 times in the back was examined for that act. The court found that he had, in fact, struck Ticus. And then the court attached to that finding a phrase that deserves to be quoted, because no summary improves on it. It attached, in its words, no criminality to what he had done. He received a light reprimand. That was the entire consequence for the entire uniformed side of the entire day. Understand the mechanism, because the mechanism is the point. This was not a jury of ordinary citizens weighing evidence against a stranger. It was a military court composed of officers sitting in judgment on fellow officers and fellow soldiers inside the very institution whose conduct was in question. A body was asked to decide whether it had committed a crime, and it decided that it had not. There is a reason we do not, as a rule, let people serve as judges in their own cases. Ludlow is what that reason looks like when it is ignored. The court that judged the militia was, in every way that mattered, the militia. The military verdict is even more striking when you set it beside a different finding that came earlier and from outside the guard. A local coroner's inquest looked into how the people in the colony had died, and it did not reach for the language of no criminality. It placed responsibility for the deaths on the militia. Here, then, were 2 official bodies examining the same corpses and arriving at opposite conclusions. A civilian inquest, closer to the dead, said the soldiers were responsible. A military court, made of soldiers, said the soldiers had committed no crime. When 2 tribunals look at the same facts and split exactly along the line of who is judging whom, that split is itself a piece of evidence. It tells you that the disagreement was never really about the facts. It was about which institution held the power to decide what the facts would be allowed to mean. That is the deeper lesson of the court-martial, and it reaches past Ludlow. A verdict is not the same thing as the truth. A verdict is the truth as filtered through whoever was given the authority to render it. Hand that authority to a neutral party, and you may get one answer. Hand it to the accused, and you will tend to get another. The men of the Colorado National Guard were not judged by the families they had fired upon, or by the coroner who examined the dead, or by a jury of ordinary citizens. They were judged by themselves, and they returned the verdict that self-judgment almost always returns. So that is one of the 2 records of justice that came out of Ludlow. 63 charges, 10 officers, not one criminal conviction. A man who beat a prisoner soon to be killed, sent home with a reprimand, and the official finding that his act carried no criminality. If accountability for the dead had depended on the uniformed side answering for itself, the answer the record gives is that no one answered at all. But accountability, in the months after Ludlow, was not idle. Courts were busy. Indictments were being drawn up, and trials were being prepared, and men were being marched toward the possibility of the gallows. It is just that the courts were not looking up the hill at the men who had held the machine gun. They were looking down into the ashes of the colony, at the people who had lived in the tents. While the militia was busy exonerating the militia, the civil authorities of Colorado turned their attention to the strikers, and they did it with an energy that the Ludlow dead never received. More than 400 indictments were handed down against union leaders and striking miners. The charges were the heavy ones: murder, arson, conspiracy. The 10 days' war had given the prosecutors real material to work with, because the strikers had in fact killed and burned in those days after the colony fell. But the sheer weight of it, 400 indictments aimed downward while 63 charges dissolved upward, tells you which direction the machinery of justice was built to run. The clearest single case was that of John Lawson. Lawson was one of the Union's most important leaders in Colorado, and the authorities singled him out and tried him for murder, for a death that occurred during the conflict. His actual personal connection to the killing was thin. It did not matter. He was convicted of murder and faced life in prison. The message of that conviction was not subtle. The men who organized the strike would be made to pay, personally, for the violence of the coalfield, while the men who had fired the machine gun into the colony had already been sent home. The Lawson trial had the character of a demonstration more than an inquiry. He was a leader, and leaders are made into examples, and the prosecution's real target was less the individual man than the movement he stood for. The legal theory used against him was expansive, the kind of reasoning that can attach a single death during a sprawling conflict to an organizer who was nowhere near the act, on the ground that he had helped set the larger struggle in motion. Notice what that theory would have done if it had been applied evenly. It would have placed the operators and the militia commanders in the dock beside him, because they too had helped set the struggle in motion, with far greater power to have prevented it. But it was not applied evenly. It was aimed in a single direction, the same legal imagination that could find a Union leader guilty of a killing he did not commit, could find no crime whatever in the men who had poured machine gun fire into a colony of families. That is not a defect in how the law was used at Ludlow. That is the design showing through. And the message of it reached exactly the people it was meant to reach. Every organizer in Colorado now understood that to lead a strike was to risk a rope, whatever one had personally done, while to wear the state's uniform during a massacre was to risk nothing at all. The law had been turned into a weapon pointed at one kind of person, and everyone who might have followed Lawson could see precisely where the path led. Lawson's conviction did not survive. On appeal, it was overturned, and over the following years, most of the great pile of indictments against the strikers came apart as well. Charges were dismissed. The handful of convictions that had been won were reversed. In the end, the criminal courts of Colorado, having pointed 400 indictments at the miners, secured essentially nothing that lasted, just as the military courts, having examined 63 charges against the guardsman, had produced essentially nothing at all. But look closely at how those two nothings were reached, because they are not the same nothing. The militia was cleared. It was affirmatively found not to have committed crimes, its members exonerated. The man who beat Luis Ticas told that his act carried no criminality. The strikers were not cleared in that sense. They were pursued, indicted by the hundreds, put on trial, convicted, and only rescued later by appeals courts, after years under the shadow of the gallows. One side was told, formally and finally, that it had done no wrong. The other side was told it would answer for everything, and then slowly, grudgingly, at the appellate level, had that answer taken back. The daily experience of those two outcomes could not have been more different, even if the final tally in both columns reads like acquittal. And the raw counts understate the human weight of the difference, because an indictment is a punishment even when it never ends in a conviction. To be charged with murder is to spend months or years with your life suspended, your freedom in doubt, your family's future hanging on the decision of a court that has already shown you which side it favors. 400 such charges, spread across the Union's leadership and its rank and file, were not merely a legal event. They were a way of keeping the survivors of Ludlow occupied with saving themselves, of turning the people who might have pressed hardest for a reckoning into defendants fighting for their own liberty. Even a failed prosecution can succeed at that. It can exhaust the accused, drain the union's money into lawyers, and make an example of what happens to those who fight. Measured that way, the 400 indictments were not a failure of the effort to punish the strikers. They were the effort to punish the strikers, and it largely worked, whatever the appeals court said years later. This is the answer to the sharper question, the one from the very beginning. When the smoke cleared and the courts opened, who was made to answer for the dead of Ludlow? And the documented answer is that the people made to answer were, overwhelmingly, the people who had been shot at, burned out, and buried. The uniformed men who did the shooting and the burning answered to a court of their own kind and were sent home. If this were a story about a single chaotic afternoon, it would be a tragedy. It is the 18 months afterward, the 63 charges against 10 officers set beside the 400 indictments against the families, that turn it into something colder and more deliberate, and that is the real subject of this film. And here the ground shifts, because there was one venue the operators and the Colorado courts could not fully control. It sat in Washington, and then it came to New York, and it had the power to put John D. Rockefeller Jr. himself under oath and ask him, in public, what he had known and what he had done. For a few days in the spring of 1915, the distance the man in New York had kept from the camps was about to close. 2 years before the massacre, Congress had created a body called the Commission on Industrial Relations. Its job was to study why American industry kept erupting into violence, and it was chaired by a Kansas City lawyer named Frank Walsh, a man with genuine sympathy for labor and a prosecutor's instinct for a public reckoning. When Ludlow happened, Walsh had found his defining subject, and he pursued it with an intensity that made powerful men deeply uncomfortable. Consider how rare the thing he was attempting actually was. The Colorado courts had shown that the ordinary machinery of justice, the local prosecutors and the military boards, would not reach upward. The whole architecture of American power in that era was built to keep a man like Rockefeller at a safe remove from the consequences of what his companies did. A federal commission with the power to subpoena was one of the very few instruments that could pierce that remove, could compel the owner himself to sit in a chair, in public, and answer questions he could not route through a manager or a lawyer. Walsh knew exactly what he had, and he was not going to waste it on politeness. There is a detail from just before the massacre that Walsh would not let the country forget. 2 weeks before the colony burned, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had been called to Washington to testify before a committee of Congress about the Colorado strike. There, under questioning, he had defended the operators' central position, the refusal to recognize the Union, and he had defended it as a matter of principle. Pressed on whether he would hold to that stand even if the struggle continued and lives were lost, he made clear that he would. He framed the open shop, the right, as he saw it, to run the mines without a union, as a principle worth great sacrifice. He said this from a comfortable room in Washington, 2,000 miles from the tents. 2 weeks later, the sacrifice he had spoken of in the abstract took the concrete form of 2 women and 11 children in a pit. That sequence, the principle declared in April, and the bodies found in April, is why the reaction to Ludlow did not stay in Colorado. It came to Rockefeller's own door. Demonstrators gathered outside the family's offices in New York. Protesters kept a silent vigil, some of them in mourning black, over the children of the colony. The writer, Upton Sinclair, was among those who made the Rockefeller name and Ludlow into a single phrase in the public mind. For a man who had spent his life being told the miners were content, it must have been a strange and terrible thing to become, almost overnight, the most hated name in American industry. The fury did not stay in Colorado, and it did not stay peaceful. In New York, demonstrators gathered outside the Rockefeller offices on Lower Broadway. The writer Upton Sinclair helped organize what became known as the morning pickets, men and women who walked in silence outside the building wearing black armbands, and Sinclair was arrested for it. Protesters carried the anger to the edge of the family's estate north of the city. For a family that had always been able to keep the public at a comfortable distance, the public was suddenly at the gate, and it was not leaving. Some of the rage ran past protest into something darker, and it has to be reported as honestly as everything else in this account. In the summer after Ludlow, a group of anarchists in New York, enraged by the massacre, appear to have been preparing an attack on the Rockefeller estate. In July of 1914, a bomb they were handling detonated early in a tenement on Lexington Avenue, tearing the top off the building and killing several of the plotters themselves. It is a grim episode, and it cuts against any tidy picture of gentle victims and nothing more. Ludlow did not only produce grief and reform. In a few people, it produced a hunger for revenge that became intended terror, and that too belongs in the full weight of what the massacre set loose. The national press, which had often treated the strike as a distant labor quarrel, now turned hard. The image of children dead in a pit was not something the ordinary tools of reassurance could easily dissolve. For a stretch of weeks, the Rockefeller name was tied to Ludlow in the public mind as tightly as any name has ever been tied to a catastrophe. That is the pressure that makes everything the family did next make sense. The hearings, the coalfield tour, the bulletins mailed to the nation's editors, all of it was an answer to this moment, when the most powerful commercial name in America had become, for a season, one of the most despised. Then, Frank Walsh got him under oath. In 1915, the Commission on Industrial Relations brought Rockefeller Jr. before it, and for 3 days Walsh questioned him in public, and the questioning was not gentle. A young journalist named Walter Lippmann, watching, described the atmosphere in the room as one of no quarter. Walsh's aim was not to win a criminal conviction. He could not deliver one. His aim was to establish, in the public record, a fact the Colorado courts had worked hard to avoid, that the responsibility for Ludlow did not stop at the hills above the colony. To do that, Walsh went at the paper. He put in front of the country the letters and telegrams that had passed between Rockefeller Jr. in New York and the men who ran Colorado Fuel and Iron for him on the ground. And those documents told a story that the phrase "knew them only on paper" could no longer fully cover. They showed that Jr. had been kept informed through the strike. They showed that he had backed the hardline policy, the absolute refusal to recognize the Union, and had encouraged the men carrying it out to stand firm. The absentee owner, it turned out, had not been absent from the decisions. He had been in New York, but he had been in the loop, and he had chosen the line the company held. Here is where the reframe becomes unavoidable, and where the whole shape of the story turns. For most of a year, the argument about Ludlow had been an argument about a hillside. Who fired first? Whether the tents were burned on purpose, whether Linderfelt lost his temper. Those are questions about a few dozen men on a patch of ground on a single day, and the record, as we have seen, cannot fully answer some of them. Walsh moved the question. He did not ask only what the men on the hill had done. He asked who had built the world that put them there, and who had chosen the policy they were enforcing, and who had the power to have chosen differently. By that measure, the answer ran straight up, out of the coalfield, across 2,000 miles, and into an office in New York. The man with the most power over the camps, the man who could have granted recognition, or ordered restraint, or simply visited and seen for himself, had instead trusted his managers, endorsed their hardest line, and defended it before Congress as a principle worth the cost. He had not pulled a trigger. He had done something with larger consequences. He had set and held the policy that made the coalfield a place where triggers would be pulled. That is the true center of gravity of Ludlow, and it is the part the ordinary telling misses when it treats the day as a spontaneous tragedy. A spontaneous tragedy has no address. This one did. This is the place to be careful about a distinction that the whole story turns on: the difference between legal responsibility and historical responsibility. The courts had spoken to the first. They had asked whether specific men had committed specific crimes that could be proven under the law, and they had answered, for the men in uniform, no. Nothing the commission did could overturn that. But legal responsibility is a narrow instrument. It asks only whether a particular hand can be tied to a particular act beyond a reasonable doubt, and it is designed, quite deliberately, to let a great many people who share in a wrong go free. Historical responsibility is a wider question. It asks, who built the situation? Who held the power to change it? Who chose not to, and who benefited from the choice? A man can be innocent in the first sense and heavily responsible in the second, and pretending those are the same thing is one of the oldest ways that power escapes its own record. Walsh's genius was to insist on the wider question in a public forum, where the narrow answers of the courts could not simply close the file. He was not accusing Rockefeller Jr. of pulling a trigger. He was establishing, on the record, that the man had set the policy, held the power, and reaped the returns, and that these facts carried a weight the acquittals could not erase. The distinction matters far beyond Ludlow, because it is the distinction that every powerful institution blurs when it points to a court's verdict and says the matter is settled. A verdict settles the legal question. It does not settle the historical one, and the historical one is usually the one that matters more. The commission could not jail anyone, and it did not pretend it could. What it could do, and did, was put on the permanent public record a chain of responsibility that reached from the pit under the burning tent all the way to the boardroom, and to refuse the comfortable idea that a massacre is only ever the fault of the lowest-ranking man holding the gun. The power of what Walsh did lay in the paper, and it is worth being clear about why the paper mattered so much. Anyone can make an accusation. What Walsh had were the company's own documents, the correspondence that had passed between the New York office and the men running Colorado Fuel and Iron on the ground. In those letters and telegrams, the strike was discussed as a policy to be managed, and the refusal to recognize the union was treated as a line to be held. They showed that the man in New York had been kept informed as the conflict escalated and had encouraged his officers to stand firm rather than yield. This is what made the testimony so damaging. It was not a matter of Walsh's opinion against Rockefeller's. It was Rockefeller's own words, read back to him in public, establishing that the policy enforced at the point of a machine gun had been endorsed from the top. That is the exact move that the ordinary telling of Ludlow loses, and it is the reason this episode spends so long on rooms far from the coalfield. A massacre, framed as a chaotic afternoon, has no author. Everyone reaches for the nearest uniformed man and stops there. What the documents did was restore the authorship. They showed that the conditions in the camps, the refusal to bargain, the whole posture that made the coalfield combustible, were not acts of nature or the whims of a lieutenant. They were choices, made by people with names, who had the power to choose otherwise and did not. Walsh could not put those people in prison, but he could make the record say who they were, and he did. And something in Rockefeller Jr. appears to have changed under that pressure. Whether the change was a genuine awakening of conscience or a shrewd reading of a ruined reputation is a question historians still argue, and an honest account leaves it open, because the surviving record shows the actions clearly and the private heart only dimly. What is not in doubt is that the man who emerged from those 3 days under Walsh's questioning was not the same public figure who had gone in. He had felt, for the first time, the full weight of what his name was now attached to. He resolved to do something about it. The question was what? He could not undo the pit. He could not bring back Louis Ticas or Mary Petrucci's children. He could not make the courts-martial come out differently or the 400 indictments disappear from the record. What he could do, with the almost unlimited resources of the Rockefeller fortune, was work on the one thing that was still very much in play and that mattered enormously to a family whose wealth depended on public goodwill. He could work on the story. He could change what the word Ludlow would mean to the millions of people who would never read a court-martial transcript or a congressional report. For that, he did not turn to a lawyer or a mine manager. He turned to a new kind of professional, a man who did something that barely had a name yet. In 1914, a man whose work on Ludlow would help define an entire industry that shapes what you believe to this day. His name was Ivy Lee, and the tools he built for the Rockefellers in the aftermath of the massacre are the last, and in some ways, the most important, part of this story. Ivy Lee had started as a newspaperman, and that was the point of him. He understood, better than the lawyers and the mine managers, how a story got into a paper and how it got into a reader's head. In an age when the very idea of a professional persuader was new, Lee grasped that you did not have to censor the press or bribe it. You could simply feed it. You could hand editors and ministers and professors a steady supply of clean, confident, ready-to-print facts, and many of them would pass those facts along without ever checking where they came from. For the Rockefellers, in the aftermath of Ludlow, Lee built exactly that machine. He produced a series of bulletins, 19 of them in all, and gave the series a title that is worth hearing slowly, because the title is the whole strategy in miniature. He called them Facts Concerning the Struggle in Colorado for Industrial Freedom. Consider what that phrase does. It takes a conflict in which a company's guards and a captured state militia had burned a colony full of families, and it renames it a struggle for freedom, with the clear implication that the freedom in question belonged to the operators and the men who wanted to work without a union. The dead children do not appear in that title. A principle does. The bulletins went out to a carefully chosen audience, not to everyone, but to the people who told everyone else what to think: editors of newspapers, clergymen, college professors, legislators, the men whose opinions became other people's opinions. And the content of the bulletins matched the title. They told the operators' version of the strike. They cast the violence as the work of outside union agitators who had imposed a needless war on contented workers. They minimized what the militia had done. And on the central horror, the deaths at the colony, they were, by the assessment of later historians, misleading and inaccurate, shaping the account of the militia's actions and of how the people in the tents had died into a form that protected the company. That is the plain description, and it is important to keep it plain, because the temptation with a story like this is to reach for the language of grand conspiracy, and that is not what the record supports, and not what this channel does. There was no secret cabal. There was something more ordinary and, in its way, more chilling. There was a paid professional, working in the open, mailing confident documents to influential people, documents whose selection of facts was built to move responsibility away from his client. What makes the bulletins damning is not some hidden cipher inside them. It is what they leave out. You can read the operator's account of Colorado's struggle for industrial freedom and never learn how 2 women and 11 children came to die in a hole under a burning tent. The omission is the message. There is a sharp irony in Ivy Lee being the man for this work, and it is a matter of record. Years before Colorado, Lee had announced a set of principles for his new profession, a public promise that he would deal openly with the press and supply accurate information rather than hidden spin. He had sold himself as the honest alternative to the old backroom press agent. And then, for the Rockefellers, he produced a run of bulletins that later students of the record judged to be misleading and inaccurate on the central facts, on how the militia had behaved, and on how the people in the colony had died. The man who had promised the press the truth mailed the country a version of Ludlow shaped to protect his client. That gap between the stated principle and the actual product is the whole young craft of public relations captured in one career. The method itself was quiet, and that was its power, because it looked nothing like what people expect propaganda to look like. Lee did not rant, and he did not lie in the crude, obvious way that invites disbelief. He produced calm, confident, professional documents that looked exactly like information, and he sent them to the very people whose job was to inform everyone else. An editor working against a deadline, a professor asked for a comment, a minister preparing to speak on the events of the day could pick up a Rockefeller bulletin and find a neat set of ready-made facts, and could pass them along without ever asking who had assembled them or what had been left out. The persuasion was folded inside the format. It arrived dressed as neutral fact, which is the most effective disguise there is. Not everyone was fooled, and Lee paid a price in reputation among those who saw what he was doing. Critics gave him a nickname that stuck to him for the rest of his life and beyond it. They called him Poison Ivy. To the people who coined it, he was a man who dressed falsehood in the clothing of fact and mailed it to the nation, and the poison was the quiet, plausible, well-printed kind that a reader swallows without noticing. But being disliked by critics is not the same as failing, and by the measure that mattered to his client, Ivy Lee did not fail. Slowly, the story began to move his way, and Lee was not finished, because the bulletins were only the written half of his plan. The other half required the most reluctant public figure in America to do something he had never done. It required John D. Rockefeller Jr. to go to Colorado in person. In 1915, the year Frank Walsh had put him under oath, Rockefeller Jr. traveled to the Colorado coalfield. It was, on the surface, a simple visit, and that was the genius of it. He went down into a mine. He walked through the camps that his managers had run and that he had known only from reports. He talked with miners. He inspected houses. At a social gathering, he danced with the wives of the men who dug his coal. And at every step, there were photographers, because Ivy Lee understood that a picture of the richest young man in America, in his shirt sleeves, underground, shaking a miner's hand, would do more to change public feeling than 1,000 pages of testimony. It worked. The image that came out of that trip was not the absentee owner who had defended a deadly principle from a office 2,000 miles away. It was a concerned, humble young reformer, come to see for himself and to make things right. The distance that had defined him, the distance the commission had used against him, was quietly erased by a few days of careful appearances. The man on paper became, in the newspapers, a man of the people. The visit was paired with something more durable than a photograph. Rockefeller Jr. brought in a former Canadian labor minister named William Lyon Mackenzie King, a man who would one day be Prime Minister of Canada, and set him to designing a new system for the Colorado mines. It was called the Colorado Industrial Plan, and it was widely known as the Rockefeller Plan, and it was presented as a great step forward for the working man. Under it, the miners would have representatives who could bring grievances to management. There would be committees. There would be procedures. On its face, it looked like the company had finally agreed to listen. But look at what the plan carefully did not contain, because once again the omission is the message. It did not contain an independent union. The representatives it created answered, in the end, to a structure the company designed and controlled. It was a form of what later generations would call a company union, an arrangement that gave workers the appearance of a voice, while ensuring that the voice could never become a union strong enough to bargain as an equal. The very thing the miners had struck and died for, recognition of the united mine workers, was the one thing the Rockefeller Plan was built to prevent, by offering a controlled substitute in its place. Look closely at the design of the tour, because it is a small masterpiece of the craft, and every piece of it was deliberate. A man who had defended a deadly principle from an office was placed, instead, in a mine, in shirt sleeves, at the working face, so that the picture would say labor rather than ownership. A man accused of treating miners as figures on a page was shown listening to them in their own camps. A man whose distance had been used against him under oath was made, for the camera, the least distant figure imaginable, close enough to dance with a miner's wife. None of these images was false in the narrow sense. He really did go down and shake the hands and dance. And yet the sum of them was a lie of proportion, because a few stage days of nearness were arranged to answer years of decisions made from far away. The photographs did not refute the record. They were designed to make people stop consulting it. The plan that came with the photographs worked the same way, offering a form that answered the feeling of the demand while withholding its substance. The miners had wanted a union that could bargain as an equal. What they were given was a company structure through which they could raise complaints. To a reader of a newspaper, the two could sound almost alike, which was precisely the point. The distance between them, the difference between a voice you control and a voice that can genuinely resist you, was exactly the distance the whole strike had been fought across, and the plan was built to blur it into invisibility. How to judge that plan is a genuine dispute, and honesty requires holding it open. To its admirers then and since, it was a sincere experiment in industrial peace, an early form of welfare capitalism that improved conditions in the camps and treated workers with more dignity than before. To its critics, it was a sophisticated tool for keeping real unions out, dressed in the language of reform, and its deeper purpose was to rehabilitate a name rather than to empower the men underground. The record supports pieces of both readings, and the fair conclusion is that it did some real good for the miners while doing an enormous good for the Rockefellers, and that the second was never an accident. Because here is the outcome that the bulletins and the tour and the plan were built to produce, and did. The Rockefeller name recovered. John D. Rockefeller Jr. went on to be remembered by most Americans not as the owner behind Ludlow, but as a great philanthropist, the man who gave away fortunes and built museums and restored colonial towns. And Ludlow itself, which had for a few weeks in 1914 been the most infamous word in the country, faded. It slipped out of the school books. It became a thing that specialists knew and the general public did not. The campaign to change what Ludlow meant did not just defend a man. Over time, it very nearly erased an event. Before following the record forward, it is worth asking what became of the people who made it. The contrast in their fates is its own kind of evidence. John D. Rockefeller Jr. lived a long life and became, in the public memory, one of the great philanthropists of the age. His name attached to foundations and universities and famous restorations. The coal field, a distant and largely forgotten episode. Mackenzie King, the man who designed the company plan, went home to Canada and became its longest-serving prime minister. Ivy Lee went on to shape the young industry of public relations for the most powerful clients in the world, though his own reputation would darken near the end of his life over his work for foreign interests. And the nickname his critics gave him followed him to the grave. Frank Walsh, who had made Rockefeller answer under oath, spent the rest of his career on the side of labor and reform. And Louis Tikas was buried. His funeral in Trinidad drew a large and grieving crowd, and he passed quickly into the memory of the labor movement as a martyr, the Union man who had died under a flag of truce, trying to protect the families in the tents. The lieutenant who had broken a rifle over his head returned to private life without penalty. The survivors carried what they could not put down. The two women who climbed out of the pit lived on with the loss of their children, and the record of what they said in the years afterward is quieter and heavier than anything the powerful men in this story ever committed to paper. That is the human ledger of Ludlow. The men who set the policy prospered and were remembered kindly. The man who tried to stop the killing was shot in the back and remembered by a union. The families paid and kept paying, long after the newspapers moved on. For a long time, the campaign to change what Ludlow meant looked like a complete success, because the surest sign of success in that kind of work is silence. The strike had been lost. The name had faded from the school books. The Rockefeller fortune had gone on to build universities and museums, and to attach itself, in the public mind, to generosity rather than to a burned colony. If you had asked most Americans across the middle of the century what happened at Ludlow, you would have been met, more often than not, with a blank look. The bulletins had done their work not by winning an argument, but by helping the argument disappear. And yet the record did not die, because records are stubborn things, and because a small number of people kept going back to them. In the 1950s, a young graduate student named George McGovern, who would decades later run for president of the United States, chose the Colorado coal strike as the subject of his doctoral dissertation. He went into the archives, into the hearing volumes and the letters and the local papers, and he reconstructed what the bulletins had worked so hard to soften. Years afterward, he turned that research into a book, And in doing so, he helped ensure that the strike had at least one careful, documented account, standing against the tide of forgetting. He was not the last. In our own century, historians return to Ludlow with fresh eyes and deeper archives, and produce serious works that place the massacre back where it belonged, at the center of the story of American labor, rather than at its forgotten edge. Then something unusual happened. People began to dig, literally. Around the turn of the century, a team of archaeologists spent years excavating the ground where the tent colony had stood. They were doing for Ludlow what is more often done for ancient cities, treating a 20th century labor camp as a site worth recovering inch by inch. And the earth gave up its evidence. They found the outlines of the tent platforms and the streets. They found the cellars the families had dug. They found the ordinary objects of interrupted lives, the fragments of dishes and canning jars and household things, and among them, the small items that make the abstraction unbearable, the pieces of a child's world left in the ground. The pit that the newspapers had named in 1914 was not only a phrase anymore, it was a measured hole in the Colorado soil, holding the physical proof of what had been said all along. That is a strange and fitting answer to Ivy Lee. He had built his case out of paper, confident documents mailed to shape what people believed. And decades later, the counter case came partly out of the ground itself, artifacts that no bulletin could edit and no press release could reframe. You can spin a testimony. You can select which facts to mail to an editor. It is much harder to spin a child's cup recovered from the floor of a cellar where children died. The recognition came slowly, but it came. In 2009, the site was formally designated a National Historic Landmark, a rare federal acknowledgement for a patch of ground remembered for most of a century, chiefly by a union. And the union never did forget. Every year, the descendants of miners and the members of the labor movement gather at the monument on the site to read the names and to mark what happened there. The gathering is small by the measure of national memory, but it has outlasted the men who tried to make Ludlow vanish, and it has outlasted them by a very long way. There is a longer consequence too, and it has to be stated with care, because the line between a real influence and a comforting story is easy to blur. The strike itself was lost. The miners did not win recognition in 1914, and the immediate lesson many drew was that even a massacre could not force a great company to bargain. But Ludlow did not vanish from the argument, even when it faded from the school books. It became one of the reference points in a decades-long national reckoning over whether workers had any enforceable right to organize at all. The public revulsion, the congressional testimony, the sheer visibility of what unchecked corporate power had produced in a Colorado canyon fed into a slow shift in how Americans thought about that question. It would take another 20 years and a national depression before the country wrote broad legal protection for union organizing into federal law. Ludlow was not the cause of that law in any simple sense, and it would be dishonest to claim it was. But it was one of the wounds the country was remembering when it finally decided that the balance of power in the workplace could not be left entirely to the owners. The families in the tents did not live to see it, and they did not win their strike. What they did, without choosing to, was help make their defeat impossible to fully forget. And a defeat that cannot be forgotten does a quiet work on a nation's conscience across the years. So the effort to erase Ludlow did not fully win, and the reason it did not is worth holding on to. A powerful institution can shape a story for a season, or even for a generation. It can make an event fade from the common memory and replace a villain's reputation with a benefactor's. What it cannot finally do, so long as the archives survive and a few people are willing to read them, is make the record say something the record does not say. The bulletins are on a shelf now, studied as specimens. The dissertation and the histories are on the shelf beside them. And under the Colorado ground, the evidence waited, patient and literal, for anyone who cared enough to dig. So we come back to the question this began with, the sharper one. Not who fired first, which the record cannot answer, but who was made to answer for the dead, which it can. And the answer, laid out across the 18 months after the colony burned, is now plain. The men in uniform were tried by their own and cleared on 63 charges. One of them told that beating a soon-to-be murdered prisoner carried no criminality. The families in the tents were pursued with 400 indictments and a murder conviction that only an appeals court, years later, undid. Accountability at Ludlow was not absent. It had a direction, and the direction was down. The mechanism that produced that outcome was not a secret plot. It was a sequence, and every step of it is documented. A company that had become a government, a militia that government captured with its own money, a court that was asked to judge itself, and returned the verdict such a court always returns. And then, when the public finally looked and recoiled, a new kind of machine, built by a paid professional in the open, to change what the public saw. That last step is the reason most people have never heard of any of the earlier ones. The campaign to rewrite Ludlow worked so well that the event nearly vanished. That is the part worth carrying out of this, past the details of one Colorado spring. The tools Ivy Lee built for the Rockefellers did not stay in 1914. The confident bulletin of selected facts, mailed to the people who shape opinion. The humanizing photograph that answers an accusation with an image instead of an argument. The controlled channel that offers the appearance of a voice in place of the real thing. These became an industry, one that surrounds us now. Every time a powerful institution meets a disaster of its own making by flooding the world with reassuring, carefully chosen facts, the shape first tested on the ashes of Ludlow is running again. Once you have seen it here, at its origin, you will see it everywhere, and that recognition is worth more than the story of a single strike. An honest account has to say clearly what it cannot settle. It cannot say who fired the first shot on the 20th of April. It cannot see into John D. Rockefeller Jr. and say whether the man who went down into the mine had truly changed his heart or only changed his strategy. It cannot fully resolve whether the plan he built helped the miners or merely managed them, because the record shows it did some of each. Those are real boundaries, and pretending past them would make this no better than a bulletin. But the record outlived the bulletins, and that is the last thing worth knowing. Frank Walsh put the chain of responsibility into the permanent public record, where it still sits, all the way up to the office in New York. Survivors carried what could not be filed. Mary Petrucci, who climbed out of the pit having lost her 3 children, told people plainly that she had once been happy and sung, and that she did not sing anymore, and no bulletin ever answered that sentence. In 1918, the Union built a monument at the site, with the names of the dead carved into it. In 2003, someone came in the night and broke the stone heads off the figures, and the Union repaired them, because even now, more than a century on, the memory of Ludlow is contested down to the stone. The bulletins are archived today, studied mostly by people learning how a falsehood gets mailed to a nation. The pit is marked by a plaque on quiet ground in southern Colorado. And the record, the thing its owners spent so much to rewrite, is still here. It still says what happened. It has simply been waiting, in the court-martial transcripts and the hearing volumes and the carved names, for anyone willing to go and read it instead of the version that was printed for them.